In 2006, I quit going to church, and consequently, some of the most important people in my life basically disowned me. But I had to quit because I was having a crisis of faith. It wasn't so much that I was having doubts about God or doubts about church. Instead, I was having doubts about the way we do church. You see, the very first churches were just small spiritual communities of friends and neighbors that met in ordinary homes. And they basically functioned like extended families. The churches we have today are more institutionalized. Legally speaking, they are more likely to be actual corporations than simple communities. They usually meet in special buildings instead of people's homes. And because of all the man-made titles and hierarchy, they often function more like companies than families. When I recognized this disconnect, I quit. And I spent the next several years searching for a spiritual community that looked and functioned more like the early church. So why should this matter to anyone else? Because, as I would later discover, millions of other believers were actually leaving the institutional church at this same time. And I believe this has implications for everyone, regardless of your relationship to the church. Of course, back then I didn't realize I was part of what might be considered a growing movement today, and so I felt very much alone at the time. As far as I could tell, there were almost no books, no podcasts, no online forums, no real-world venues where anyone seemed to be having a discussion about the frustrations I felt about the institutional church model. And so I finally decided to take those frustrations and share them online in the form of an animated explainer video and cartoon blog. So let's have some fun. Here's one of the first cartoons I shared. It was on Christmas morning of 2013. As you can see, I've got a little cartoon Jesus. He's holding his birthday present, which looks conspicuously like a church building. In the cartoon, his father is saying, "What's wrong, Jesus? You said you wanted a church for your birthday." To which Jesus is replying, "Yeah, I did, but I'm having trouble getting it out of the box." Yeah, more laughter. Other cartoons and animated videos followed, where I started to get into more specific critiques of the institutional church model, and pretty quickly I began to build a following. Let me give you an example of a more specific critique. So one of the most defining characteristics of early church gatherings was the mutual participation of each member. Basically, everyone present was expected to share something, kind of like the spiritual equivalent of a potluck dinner. Yet, the church gatherings we have now look more like what we're doing today. A bunch of people politely listening to a single speaker giving a presentation. And so I did a cartoon about this too. Here's a pastor about to preach his Sunday morning sermon. And he's saying, "Today's sermon is titled, 'The Priesthood of All Believers.' Ironically, I will be doing all the talking." Yes, don't get me wrong. It's not that this isn't a fantastic format for disseminating information. A matter of fact, that's why I'm giving this presentation right now. But genuine church community is more than just the sharing of spiritual information. It's actually more about spiritual formation. And just as the word discipleship indicates, any significant spiritual formation is going to require mutual participation. For whatever reason, this reality seems lost in most of our church gatherings today. As a matter of fact, whenever I ask churchgoers, what are the main reasons you go to church? One answer that always makes the list is this: to get spiritually fed. Now, if you haven't heard that term, don't worry. This is church speak for sitting and listening to a sermon. Much the way we would watch a movie or watch a game, we've turned today's church gatherings into mere spectator sports. The thinking is, by merely listening to weekly sermons, my spiritual life is going to be somehow strengthened, even though most of us are going to forget what the sermon is about 2 days later. Now, we already know that sitting and eating won't make us physically healthy. So why would we think something similar would make us spiritually healthy? Spiritually speaking, we don't just need to eat, we also need to exercise. Since there's very little participation in today's church gatherings, when exactly do I get to exercise my calling? If all I do is sit and listen to information without any application, how am I expected to ever grow in my own unique spiritual gifts? I'm not trying to diminish the idea of a church shepherd spiritually feeding the flock. But is this all that's required for being a good shepherd? Furthermore, doesn't the institutional church model look less like shepherding sheep and more like raising veal? For those who don't know, raising veal starts with selecting a calf and putting it in a special box. The very purpose of this box is to make sure the calf always gets fed, but never gets any exercise. This calf is known as a veal crate, and it will be, this box is known as a veal crate, and it will be the calf's whole world for its entire life. From the moment it's placed in the crate, the calf isn't just fed, but overfed. Yet it's never allowed to exercise because that would build up muscle, which would prevent it from becoming tender and tasty veal one day. And so by the time the calf is ready for slaughter, it has grown completely dependent upon its box. As a matter of fact, by now it is so fat and weak that if the box is ever removed, the calf can't even stand on its own anymore. Now, I'm not insinuating all church-going believers are spiritually weak or immature. As a matter of fact, I have the good fortune of knowing many believers who have sincerely devoted their lives to genuinely loving their neighbors. But the question I'm asking is this: did they learn to love this way because of the institutional church model or in spite of it? Now, returning to my story, since the questions I ask are obviously quite provocative, I was pleasantly surprised to see that many other believers started to respond well to my work. And so after a series of well-received cartoons and videos, I eventually published a book titled Unchurching Christianity Christianity without Churchianity. Now, just so you know, the term unchurching was actually inspired by the early leaders of the homeschool movement who coined the term unschooling. Basically, they wanted to unschool their children by removing education from the classroom and returning it to the living room. Since I wanted to do something similar with church, I began using the term unchurching. But unchurching, at least in the way I'm using the word, isn't about separating believers from church community. It's actually about separating genuine church community from the business model of the church corporation. So anyway, the book in turn led to a podcast, which then birthed an online forum, and eventually a national conference, and a host of local meetups in various cities. Basically, all the things I was looking for that I couldn't find when I first quit going to church, I've been blessed to be able to provide for a few other former churchgoers like myself. And because my critiques are merely about the church model, they're not an attack on institutional church people, my work has also opened the door for me to guest speak at institutional churches and conferences. And best of all, it has led to me finally finding the type of spiritual community I was looking for. Now, your mileage may vary, but I now experience more fellowship than I had in the institutional church, more diversity, more gender equality, and I'm free to invest my money merely into people instead of pouring it into expensive church buildings and programs which spend at least half of their resources on mere overhead expenses. However, there's still a big challenge in discussing these ideas with believers who are still in the institutional church box. And I think it's because cognitive dissonance is almost required to embrace an institutional church paradigm. Cognitive dissonance occurs whenever a person simultaneously holds at least two conflicting ideas. And here's why I say this applies to the institutional church paradigm. If you ask a bunch of churchgoers to define the word church, almost all of them will tell you a church is a group of people. It's not a place, it's not a thing. Even if their church owns a building, they will likely say the church is the spiritual family that meets in that building, not the building itself. However, if you ask those same churchgoers, or if you just listen to them use the word church in day-to-day conversation, you'll begin to pick up on a contradiction, because they will also say things like, what time does church start? What church do you go to? Look at that beautiful old wooden church. Now, clearly, this means the word church is not limited to just their spiritual family, but it also applies to something separate from themselves. Otherwise, if they're only talking about their spiritual family when they're using the word church this way, they are essentially saying, what time does family start? What family do you go to? Look at that beautiful old wooden family. So yeah, I am poking a little fun here, but the truth remains, we can't have it both ways. If the church is merely people, then it isn't something separate from us that we can go to. Just so you know, a lot of the illustrations that I'm using in this presentation are from a free online comic book I created, and it is titled, are you ready? Why Christians Don't Need to Go to Church. Now, yes, the title is intended to grab people's attention, but you should know that in this comic book, I am not advocating that believers can't gather or shouldn't gather. All I'm really saying is, wherever believers are, there's the church. We don't say we go to family because we are family. Likewise, believers can't go to church because we are the church. As I mentioned earlier, millions of believers are starting to figure this out, and it's creating a mass exodus from the institutional church at the moment. However, like myself, many of these people who are leaving are not abandoning their faith. I refer to them as unchurching believers, but they're also referred to as dones, because even though they are still believers, they are done with the institutional church model. By conservative estimates, there are now over 30 million of us in the United States alone. To put that in perspective, that is nearly 1 in every 10 people you pass on the street. Not 1 in every 10 believers, 1 in every 10 people. And since the U.S. has been exporting our institutional brand of Christianity for generations now, the implications of this tectonic shift in the church landscape could prove to be pretty far-reaching. Now, depending on your view of church and your attitude toward church, this could be either very grim news or potentially exciting news. For believers who function as if church is something separate from themselves, something which must be attended, this is bad news indeed. Since church attendance is rapidly dropping, church as they know it seems to be dying. For believers like myself, who believe the church is really just people, then this is possibly good news. From our perspective, many of these believers aren't actually leaving the church. It's merely the church that's leaving the building. And if we're right, this means the church is quite literally finally breaking out of the box. Now, I think this could be good news for non-Christians as well. After all, many non-Christians actually enjoy my work, and I suspect it's because some of the things they dislike about the church are the exact things I criticize. Now, the thing I believe, which my non-Christian friends may or may not believe, is that the things I take issue with are not genuine characteristics of the actual church. They are solely products of organized Christianity, or what could be deemed Churchianity. Therefore, if believers continue to abandon this man-made institutional church model and rediscover what it means to simply be the church instead of merely going to church, I think a lot of people outside the church are about to be pleasantly surprised. And if so, I look forward to some of you getting to see, maybe for the first time, what the church was meant to be and how much more positively she can impact the world once she rediscovers her identity. However, please know, I didn't share all of this today in order to try to convince anyone that their understanding of church is wrong and my understanding of church is right. As a matter of fact, my goal today wasn't even to change anyone's mind about whether or not they should keep attending an institutional church. My goal was simply to change a few people's minds about those of us who don't. Thank you.